My name is Ernie Lopez. Everybody calls me Ernie. I was born in Arizona in 1931. And at the age of 3, my grandparents took me to live in the Yaqui Pueblo. Today it's the Yaqui Reservation. And I lived there with my grandmother and my grandfather and my uncles who were still in their teens. And it was a very pleasant life because I love the desert, and the desert had many, many things to offer for a little kid. First of all, it was all sand and sagebrush, so it was a pretty safe place to run around. And that was my earliest recollections of my childhood. When I reached the age of 5.5, 6, my grandmother started to teach me, because we spoke only Spanish, started to teach me poetry. And one of my first experiences in speaking in public was that it was the 16th of September festival for Mexico's Independence Day, which they observed. And I got on the stage and read this long poem, of which I remember a little part. But I look back and it just seemed like a very natural thing to do, but it was kind of extraordinary for a little kid. And then some of my uncles took time to teach me proper Spanish and the alphabet, and I became bilingual. By the time I was in grammar school, I had command of English and Spanish. And I am very fortunate to be able to dominate those two languages. In 1965, actually in 1964, I met my wife, and she had a shop and I had a shop, and within a very short time after we met, we got married. And the very day that we were making our plans, because we didn't want to have, now I pronounce you man and wife kind of religious thing. We wanted something that had some more meaning to us, and there wasn't any other means. And so we went to the municipal court judge in Burbank, and he married us. But the day that we were making our plans, we met a beautiful woman. She was English background, and she was looking for a way to get to a place, and it was too complicated, so we offered to take her. And as she got in the car, she said, "You two are so lovely, you must be Baha'is." And that was my introduction to the Baha'i faith. She is our spiritual mother for the rest of my eternal life. Her name was Ruby Victoria Grayson. Rose loved her very much. She really was not only a spiritual mother, but she was genuinely a mother to us. And she took us to some firesides. And it was at Russ and Gina Garcia's fireside in the Hollywood Hills that I heard my first fireside. And it was very beautiful, but I was disturbed because they never mentioned Jesus Christ. And even though I had abandoned the church a long time, I never abandoned Christ. And so that bothered me. And so it set me on a path of investigating the faith from the ground up, you might say. I already knew the Bible very, very well. But I was not fanatical in my Christianity. It's just that I knew that no matter what, Jesus Christ had to be part of my life forever. And they weren't asking me to abandon him, but they weren't talking about him. So I was a little bit testy. And the next fireside I went to, I was at Sid and Joni Balkan's house in Burbank. And that was about 6 months after I had heard about the faith, because I had resisted it. But Rose kept going to them, and she embraced the faith immediately and didn't declare right away, but she embraced it immediately. And so I loved her and I trusted her, so I knew it had to be something good, but I couldn't agree with it until I could understand it. So at that fireside at Joni Balkan's, there was a young Persian man, and he said, "I understand you're interested in learning about the faith." And he said, maybe I can give you something to read. And I said, yes. I said, I would like something to read. I said, but I want really the very beginning. How did it start? Where did it start? What happened? What were the conditions and the events that took place at that early time? And he said, well, I have this book. It's called Baha'i New Era. I said, did he write it? He said, no, I'm not interested in that book. Is it from the very beginning? He said, well, not quite. I said, we have another book. I said, well, I'll take that book. He said, no, because you can't read it. I said, if I can't read it, I don't need this religion. And he looked at me. I was not being very kind. He looked at me and he said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. He says, I mean that it's hard even for us to read it. It's called The Dawnbreakers. And that's not only a very big book, but it's very difficult to read. And so, being testy as I was, I said, well, if you don't think I'm intelligent enough to read it, then so be it. And he said, no. He said, if you want that book, I'll get you that book. And he did. He loaned me the book. And I did try to read it probably 2 or 3 times within the first week, and it was very difficult, but I got through it, and I read the entire book over a period of a year. But after I read about the Bab, I fell in love with the Bab, and I wanted to be a Babi. So what happened was that Rose and I were very involved in the community activities, and we were in Los Angeles. It was a community with tremendous Baha'i community, very large. At the time it was over 200, which was considerable for 1965. And they were really wonderful at teaching. They would hold these events. There were dances, there were get-togethers, and there was no drinking, no swearing, no contention, and it was just beautiful. And it made me love the people very much. And most, as a matter of fact, of our really closest friends, family-like relationship were with black couples. And so one couple, Clora and Harold Jackson from Los Angeles community, they became our spiritual parents, our mentors. And at their house, we went through the writings, the books, and then we declared in 1966, on the 1st of January, we went to a party and we signed our cards. It was processed by the local assembly. And as Rose and I were sitting outside the council chamber of the Assembly of Los Angeles, we looked at each other, we started to say, you think they'll accept us? I mean, only we know how unworthy we are, so something that was so wonderful appeared to be maybe out of reach. And yet when they called us in and talked to us about the faith, they asked us afterwards, both of us, because we went individually, both of us sat down waiting for them, and then they came out smiling and reached out and embraced us and says, welcome to the Baha'i community. And even though we had signed the card, we had no idea what procedures there were, and since there are no real there are no ceremonies and rituals within the faith, so to speak. But we didn't know what the procedure was, so they embraced us and they said, well, we have a surprise for you, come on downstairs. And then there was this beautiful cake that welcomed Rose and Ernie to the Baha'i community, and that was so extraordinary. It touched my heart. Anyway, we had this beautiful welcoming him to the community. There was one thing that, just in passing, I want to mention that was very special about the California community. There were still some people living from the time of Abdu'l-Baha's visit. One of them was Ramona Brown. And her daughter, Ramona Brown, was a little girl when Abdu'l-Baha came to San Francisco. And he had set her on his lap. There was a time when the believers in San Francisco, among them were very, very extraordinary people that embraced the faith and served the faith with great energies and in very beautiful ways. So it's a blessing to get to know some of these older people. As I was talking about the introduction to the faith and being received into the community, my thoughts came to Rose, who has now passed away. And she was very important in my life. She's a very, very beautiful, extraordinary person, very intelligent, very bright. Tremendous spirit to recognize the faith almost immediately and embrace it. So it's a little hard to talk about her, but I do want to say this, that when I think of how many years she served the Baha'i community, beginning almost immediately in Los Angeles, she was very staunch, very strong. In fact, a couple of times when she saw something that wasn't right, she didn't hesitate to speak up, and you couldn't really argue with her because she was right. And so, in a sense, so many of us there at that community, she would bring something up and show us the Baha'i way in her own words. And I think she was a great influence, even in the community at that time. She also served in the National Assembly committees. But even before that, before we left from Los Angeles to move, before we left California, after opening up several communities by moving there, we were invited to come to the National Center because they wanted Rose to work for us in the Secretariat. So we have 10 years of service there. And then towards the end of that, probably mainly because of my own childhood traumatic experiences, I had a lot of problems, and so she and I separated. And then she wanted to go on serving, and in order to go to the World Center, it was necessary for us to get a divorce. But we were never really separated, even though we were separated physically and divorced, but still we were so much together. She was such a big part of my life. So after a few years, then I joined her at the World Center. We remarried and served at the World Center. I for another 10 years, and Rose for a total of 16 years at the World Center. So that's just a thumb sketch version of our journey from Los Angeles 1964 or 65 to the year 1999. Then we left the World Center and returned for the inauguration of the terraces. And I will go into that part of my life a little after I share with you the service at the National Center. When Rose was invited to come, we had our two boys, Marco and Matt. And Marco was only about 5, 6 years old. And he had never known anything about the Southwest desert conditions. So as we traveled, after Rose had already flown to the National Center, I drove my pickup truck with some of our personal things in it and my boys. And as we drove through the Midwest and into Missouri, my youngest son Marco said to me, "Dad, what's the name of this park?" Because he had never seen so many trees in his life. So it was a very extraordinary journey for us as a family to move to the National Center. I arrived there knowing that I was going to have to look for employment somewhere because they didn't have a position. The National Center in 1972, when Rose arrived in January, she came right back from California after coming for an interview and began to serve right away. And I had to wait until June for the boys to be out of school. And then she prepared an apartment for us, so when we got there we had a place. But I had to go look for a job. However, they didn't have anybody that was the head of the grounds, and I had extensive experience in gardening and landscaping, even though I don't have any formal studies in that. But my knowledge of it in botanics, it was pretty extensive. So after a few weeks, because I went and worked as a volunteer in the gardens during that time, I was called to the office, and told that the National Assembly had considered what maybe I could serve in the garden as part of the staff, which I accepted. And they didn't really have anybody knowledgeable to head the grounds, which was landscape and hardscape. And I had a lot of experience. I was already in my 40s. So they offered me the position of head of grounds, and I took over all the property, the maintenance of hardscape and landscape. As I mentioned, I had a troubled childhood, so I didn't really have a lot of formal education. I didn't even finish high school, but I left high school in my sophomore year because of my relationship with my father was very, very bad and painful, and he just rejected me completely, and therefore there was no chance of really correcting that problem. And I left for Arizona, which is my homeland, and back to my community, which is basically a Hispanic Pima Indian community. The majority of my family never lived on reservations because up until maybe the 30s and 40s, there was a struggle for many of the Pima community to be claimed to be part of the tribe, simply because the government found it much easier to just classify everybody as Mexicans and try to push them out of the land here. And that was my experience as a child. And it was ingrained very strongly by my grandfather, who happened to be Spanish Basque and married to a Pima Indian woman. And he hated the American government because they were so dishonest. They would not acknowledge that the people were actually natives, as were my family. So the same story goes for the entire Southern California Indian tribes, the Tulare, the Chumash, the Mission Indians. They had to struggle for identity, even though they were there for centuries. But they spoke Spanish and had Spanish last names. And that was used as a means for ejecting the people off the land. And it happened to some degree, but fortunately, not everybody's alike. And there were many, many whites that were very fair and very helpful. And they rescued a lot of the people by fighting against this kind of tactics. So that was my childhood experience. Arriving at the National Center, I made an effort to go back to study, and I took earth sciences, which helped me with my work in landscaping. And Rose and I were there from 1972 to 1982. It was 10 years of service. I served on the Spanish-speaking National Committee, and I served also on the National Unity Race Unity Committee with people like Bill Smith, and I wish I could remember the names of all these wonderful people in that committee. What a blessing to serve with these people. They were very, very deep in Baha'i, some of them second generation Baha'is. At the end of 82, I left the National Center. I went back to California. Rose went on to the World Center. And we continued to correspond and to speak on the phone and to get together whenever she could come here, and we spent time together. And our whole process was to do reconciliation, but I had to work on myself a lot in order to turn myself around. And I managed to do that. Went to work at the World Center. The Supreme Body gave me permission to go there to serve. I was there just about a year, a little less, when I was invited to serve on the Mount Carmel projects, the terraces of the Shrine of the Bab. And there was a great experience. So the next 9 years I spent working on the projects for the Mount Carmel to beautify it, working under Faribu Sahba, the architect. And it was through his, really, I don't even have words to express my gratitude. His trust in me, his faith in me, because I got to work very closely with him. And he wanted me to take on that responsibility to do the outer natural areas, the designs for that. And what he did was, Mr. Saba and I traveled several times, all the way to Jerusalem, and then into southern Israel and northern Israel, to nurseries, and he wanted me to take a look in Jerusalem at some of the large landscape designs that were there, and he says, I want you to expand your thinking, so when you make a small design, so you enlarge it to cover a larger territory. He says, I want you to get that concept. So he mentored me. I worked side by side with him on some of these ideas. And it was a great blessing to have that opportunity, because I had no degrees, I had no documentation, but he did put me in touch with an American landscape architect who is very well known in this country. He especially works with Japan. And I spent about an hour or so with him. The man said to me, I know you can do the project because it's natural for you. You understand the process, and you can understand working on these mountains. Because he asked me what my background was. I said, I've always lived in mountains and deserts. And I said, and I identify with it, and I know it. I don't want to change what's the beauty that's there. If something has to be there, my way of approaching it is to be very conservative. And Mr. Saba loved that, because being the Holy Land and holy to us as much as to the other religions, Mr. Saba, under the guidance of the spiritual assembly to whom he had to respond, wanted to do everything that had to be done without destroying its outlook and its history, and minimal, which I think is such a blessing as Baha'is, that we are able to do that and respect nature, and to create such an incredible design in gardens, which, of course, tribute to him. I'm not claiming to be the one that did it. He did it, and he let me be one of his hands in the work, for which I'm eternally grateful. I've seen him only when I went back to the dedication of the terraces and met with a lot of the staff there. It was really a wonderful experience. And then I've talked on the phone with him a few times. So I have been very blessed to have met a person of his stature and his humility and nobility, that he would allow me an opportunity that doesn't come to people very often. So my background and my racial identity was not a barrier for me within the confines of the Baha'i community, its spirits and teachings. And I attribute my blessings to Baha'u'llah's grace, that we are different people, more conscious, more aware, not better than other people, where we are all the same, but we are more conscious, and praise be to God. This is my story.